Welcome to the 8th episode of Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Oleszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Good morning.
We are approaching a very pivotal moment in Alfred Hitchcock's career, the transition to sound. But before the transition to sound comes, in the film Blackmail from 1929, there's one more film that's still a silent picture, The Manxman, which was made in 1929, based on a novel by Sir Hall Caine. Apparently a very successful and apparently, by all accounts, a very good novel, which I haven't read. So this is the final fully silent film in Hitchcock's career. Of course, Blackmail, which we will discuss in our next episode, does also exist as a silent film, but primarily is known as a part talkie. But here we have the last incarnation of Hitchcock as a fully silent film artist. And today we'll discuss the film, we'll discuss its themes, also the acting in the film, because I think it's a particularly strong film in this regard. But the first thing that has to be said is that, again, here we have Hitchcock in a purely melodramatic mode. This is a melodrama, a story of two men and one woman, of jealousy, of betrayal, of love, of passion, of two different men of very different personalities. And the opening question: how did you like The Manxman?
I must say once again that I'm not a huge fan of the melodramatic Hitchcock, so I had troubles with The Manxman as well. And I wonder what you think, precisely what you think about the acting, because I found this part probably the biggest weakness, in my opinion, except maybe for Annie Ondra, whom we'll talk more in a couple of minutes. So it's very interesting for me to watch the melodramatic Hitchcock. It's a similar feeling to watch, for example, fully comedic Hitchcock, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, right? It's something a bit different, something at the margins of his, let's say, the mainstream of his career. Similarly to The Farmer's Wife, I liked the bucolic setting, the way he depicts nature and seaside, ships, the fisherman's milieu, and Hitchcock was praised as this realist filmmaker by his contemporaries. So I liked this part, but I didn't find the plot or the way it's developed by actors convincing enough. So I think maybe our opinion differs on this one.
Yes, well, we should also mention that this is the film that marks the final collaboration between Alfred Hitchcock and Elliot Stannard, his screenplay writer that he collaborated with frequently before and that we mentioned many times on this podcast. Well, first of all, let's talk about the story a little bit. The story is of, as we said, first of all, it's all located on the Isle of Man, hence the title, The Manxman, the man from the Isle of Man. It wasn't shot on the Isle of Man. It was actually shot in Cornwall, which was more handy for the filmmakers. It was closer and easier to shoot. But as you said, the main feature of the film in terms of its visual style is definitely the natural beauty of the island. We can see many rocky cliffs and beaches, and it's all used very, very well. The story is of jealousy and betrayal. Annie Ondra plays Kate, the daughter of an innkeeper in the Isle of Man, and there are two men in her life, Pete, played by Carl Brisson, whom we've already met as the lead actor in The Ring. There was a separate episode that we discussed The Ring in. A Danish actor, by the way. And Malcolm Keane plays Philip. So there are those two guys, Philip and Pete. And they come from very different backgrounds. There is a very clear class distinction. Pete is a working class guy, he's a fisherman, and Philip is a lawyer, a solicitor. on his way to becoming fully fledged judge. So the main story is basically of Pete falling in love with Kate. Philip falls in love with her as well, but sort of very honorably takes a step back because he actually helps Pete to win Kate's affection. And then when Pete leaves the island and he disappears for a longer period of time, even there was actually he proposed to Kate, she accepted the proposal. Philip sleeps with Kate, and there's this huge sense of guilt on Kate's part. Pete unexpectedly comes back to the island. It turns out that he's very much alive, and there's this very long section of the film that is purely devoted to the depiction of guilt on Kate's part mostly and on Philip's part. So this is a very interesting melodrama for me, and that was I think the most interesting part. Answering the question why I like the film so much is that for the most part it's really devoted to this theme of guilt, because Pete remains ignorant of the whole love affair. It's not like there are those two alpha males fighting for this woman. It's basically one guy who is highly naive and very good natured, and he's smiling all the time, and he would never expect his friend to be sleeping with his girlfriend. And on the other hand, and this I think is the most important and most interesting thing about this film, we have the character of Philip, who is deeply stricken with guilt in this film. And I think this is a very Hitchcockian trait. When we talk, often we talk about Hitchcock's Catholicism, and many biographers, Donald Spoto and McGilligan, they always stress this part. And here, Philip, for the most part, he's never smiling in this film. He's very deeply ashamed of what he has done, and there's almost this sense of like Conradian guilt, like Lord Jim, that he did something so awful in his own view that he cannot really enjoy life anymore. He's so deeply in this state of guilty feelings. And I found that interesting, that it's not like in Pleasure Garden, where there were those very clear outbursts of emotion, like people competing for each other's affection. Here it's really very squarely focused on guilt, and the whole second half of the movie, guilt is the main subject of the film. And actually sometimes to the point of self-parody, because I would say that Philip many times looks as if his loved one just died, like he's not smiling when he sees his friend, like he's very gloomy in this film. But I have the feeling that maybe Hitchcock connected with this material because of this deep streak of guilty feelings that the characters go through.
This is a fantastic remark and very interesting, and we should add that the wedding scene between Pete and Kate is depicted as a funeral, or at least Pete says that it's a wedding, it's not a funeral. So we have this atmosphere and this idea of reversing the order, or like turning the world upside down, that what should be joyful and funny is very sad. So it's there, and to develop this theme of guilt, I would add also the element of friendship, because this is also the movie about this, let's say, doomed friendship in a way. And it's perverse on Hitchcock's part, I would say, because Pete uses Philip to, for example, to propose. He uses him, he asks for his help, not maybe uses, but he asks for his help to propose, to speak with the girl's father. And also when he wants to, there's this balcony scene, almost kind of Shakespearean, like Romeo and Juliet, because they cannot be together because the father says that Pete is very poor, and that's why he wants to leave the island and go to earn some money in foreign lands, quote. And Philip helps him to talk with her. He's going up on his shoulders to the balcony. So he's there. Philip is there all the time as this kind of auxiliary person, somebody who helps him, who is there to, from Pete's perspective, to facilitate his let's say love affair or his pursuits, but it doesn't work that way. So that's pretty fascinating, and the fact that it's a simple device, to kill the character, but in reality he's alive. But it's striking in this movie because he comes back as a kind of a ghost. He doesn't look like a ghost, but we sense, I think, from the narrative structure that he should not be there from the character's perspective. I mean, it's a very striking scene when Kate says to Philip that we are now free. He's dead. We are now free. We can do what we want. We can fall in love, and then he comes back like this, unwanted presence. He's just returning, and this has this, maybe that's my reading, this horror quality. The movie is not scary at all, but there is something very uncanny as well in his return, because he's so joyful, he's smiling so much, and as you mentioned, he's a very naive character, and he doesn't realize anything, and we sense that they don't want him there. So this is pretty interesting. But I found Malcolm Keane's performance, who plays Philip, so the strict character, the lawyer, stricken with guilt, as you mentioned, and guilt runs in this family, we could say. There is this scene with his aunt that who says that his father married below his position, below his state, and that Philip cannot do the same because he has important obligations in the world. He wants to be a prestigious lawyer, and there is a courtroom scene towards the end. So he's stricken with guilt, and Pete, on the other hand, is a character that I think we do not fully respond to, because he's probably too unaware of the situation, and there is this discrepancy between our knowledge as viewers and his knowledge, which is of course the trademark Hitchcock theme, right? This difference in knowledge between the audience and the character. But coming back to Malcolm Keane, I had this impression that he cannot really forcefully translate the feelings of his character to the screen. I didn't believe his performance. He's so square and strict that he left me, kind of cold.
I like what you said about the difference between what the character knows and what the audience knows. That's definitely a Hitchcockian trait, and it's almost like Hitchcock is toying with the audience and with the character here, because for a very long time we are aware already of the love affair between Philip and Kate, and Pete, in his innocence, in this sort of smiling, dimpled innocence, seems almost like we are waiting for the blow to arrive, like we are waiting for the painful moment of realization. I was much more convinced by the performance of Malcolm Keane. I think that he communicated this deep streak of very dark guilt very well. And there are two things I think that we are probably not very well equipped to discuss. I think they run very deeply in British culture. I don't have enough knowledge to really discuss the roots of those things, but those two things are, for one, the deep sense of guilt connected to adultery, even when it wasn't technically adultery, because they thought that Pete was dead. So one could say that why all the guilt? Like, you didn't know, right? You were unaware. So why should be guilty? So I think there's something about the sense of manhood, probably something deep inside the patriarchal structures of British manhood and society that here gets explored by Hitchcock. And I don't really have the full knowledge to read this, because someone could really say to Philip, snap out of it. It doesn't even seem like he's so passionate about Kate. It seems that he is very able to disconnect from her after the arrival of Pete, but still he's stricken by the sense that he violated the friendship with Pete. And the second thing is the class thing, which I also don't have the full knowledge to read, but it's very strange and interesting notion that these two people, these two guys, were friends throughout childhood. They come from different worlds. It's very clear that it's not a world of easily broken or easily crossed class boundaries. When as soon as Pete proposes to Kate, Kate's parents are immediately opposed to it. Say that how could you even think of that our daughter, who is an innkeeper's daughter, would marry you, a fisherman, right? You're completely out of your way. So there's very clear sense, and also there's this class prejudice on the behalf of the privileged classes, because Philip's mother says that you have your obligations towards our class. So on one hand you have this very, very clear sense of class divide. On the other hand, we are supposed to believe, and we do on some level, that those two guys were completely like best friends, and they grew up together, they played together, and in fact Philip is defending Pete and the whole class of fishermen at the beginning of the film, when he is actively using his legal skills to better the situation of the fishermen in the village. There's this sort of like, it's almost like a Soviet film at the beginning, with the strike and with the petition and workers' rights. It's all very rousing and enthusiastic. Probably the only overtly political scene in Hitchcock until Topaz. I don't know, but it's very, very clear. So how those two guys actually were friends, it's not very clear. So, but it gives the story tension. I think it shows that on a personal level, it's almost like the love story between those two guys, and Philip is very believable as, let's say, Pete's lover who betrayed him with her rather than the other way around. And on the other hand, there's this sense that they could be friends as children. It was okay, like before they reach maturity, but now they belong to those very, very different worlds. And also, the last thing I will say about class in this film, it seems that class divisions are non-existent until sex becomes part of them. Until it's like friendship between guys, it's okay, they can be friends. But as soon as you want to marry someone from a different class, then it really becomes a problem, and it becomes an obstacle. But we didn't talk anything about the visual style of the film, so let's discuss this. And were there any images that you liked here in the Manxman?
Oh yes, a lot of images. The beginning is beautiful, as the scene you mentioned, this quasi-socialist scene with the petition, and there is even this very funny title that Philip is defending the lowly fisher folk. So yes, I liked it a lot, and also the scene of the suicide is pretty cleverly done, with Eniondra jumping into the ocean, and then we have this blurry image that Charles Barr rightly points that it may anticipate both Psycho's shower scene, the ending of the shower scene, but also I think this theme of woman jumping into the water and kind of dissolving herself in the water is, of course, the theme, the visual theme of Vertigo, which I like a lot. But basically, I think, and I wonder if you agree once again with Charles Barr, who likes this movie a lot, and he suggests that in Hitchcock's more successful movies, the point of view shots are less flamboyant, that he uses very flamboyant point of view shots in this less successful movies like Downhill, but here they are less flamboyant and more to the point, more successfully woven into the narrative. And I wonder if you think it's really that important in this movie, because I had the impression that Hitchcock is more interested in staging in this movie, in kind of putting the characters in such order that we could, maybe interpret some message, some class distinction, or just some emotional situation, like when two men stand in front of the screen, and Anyondra is in the background, kind of standing behind them. They're obscuring her in a way. So, did you think that Hitchcock's, much praised camera work is kind of vivid in this movie?
I definitely felt like it was the most subdued and subtle of all the Hitchcock films so far. I didn't discern any flamboyant or showy uses of the camera of the kind that we discussed so many times on this podcast, like the trick photography, or something that appears very large but then turns out to be very small. It's probably, and I hate this word, but probably the most realistic of the films that we saw so far. I mean, in terms that it really feels like the camera work and acting and the cutting are just at the service of telling the story and of showing those characters with, I would argue, especially in the case of Anyondra, with quite psychological depth. And it's probably, of all of the films that we saw, except for Champagne, which was a disaster, the film of Hitchcock's that definitely assumes the female perspective, very, very strongly. It's her feelings, I think, really, that Hitchcock is interested in this film, in terms of the one guy can be naive, the other can be guilt-stricken, but she is actually ambivalent. Like the guys are in a way simple. One has this very old-fashioned sense of honor, the other is just this cheery guy, the cheery fisherman. But she is genuinely complex. I mean, we can sense that she's struggling against deep passion that she feels for Philip, as unlikely as it may seem. It's very clear that she's struggling with very contradictory feelings, and you can tell it from her performance. You can tell it from how Anyondra plays this character. And also many authors, I think all of the authors that we read for this podcast, mention that she's the first Hitchcock blonde, that she's the first in this long line of Hitchcock blondes. But I would say also that I think she's the first genuinely great actress that we saw in a Hitchcock film. She's really fantastic. She's a very good screen actress. She's we can mention that she's actually being mentioned in many of the books as a Polish actress, which is not accurate. We are Polish, and we did some digging online. So what did you dig out?
She was born in Tarnów, so it is now, and it was part of Poland. But she was born in 1903, when Poland was not on the map. We were partitioned then. But what is more important in this regard is that she was born to Czech parents. So she's more of a Czech actress born in Poland, we should say. So her Polish roots are not really. You cannot say that she had like some genuine connection to Polish culture. So that's probably, and I wonder if we should call it a mistake in books such as Charles Barr's or in Tom Rail's monograph on blackmail, or maybe it's just some kind of a simplification. It's difficult to say, but certainly we. As Poles, we do not claim Anyondra as one of Polish actresses of the silent and early sound period.
Well, we are not denying her either, but she definitely was born in what is now a Polish city, and historically is also a Polish city. But the main important thing is she was born of Czech parents, and her career was also elsewhere. A funny trivia fact is that she later on in life she was married to a famous boxer, Max Schmeling, who actually, and this is funny, I think John Russell Taylor mentioned in his biography that Hitchcock actually disapproved of this marriage. He wrote her a telegram saying that how could you marry a boxer, which is an interesting thing in terms of how Manxman is all about class divisions, but it seems that Hitchcock felt that he was entitled to comment on her love choices. And the Wikipedia entry on Anyondra also says that she even appeared in a film with Max Schmeling, which is interesting. I would love to see the film. It's called Knockout, but I don't really know anything about it. Well, anyhow, the point is she is very good. She is very good in this film, both as the amorous young woman and also as a sexual being. There is a sex scene that cuts to a millstone turning, which is an interesting, early sex-related cut. As we are talking, actually, Sebastian found online that Annie Ondra played in a film called Polish Blood, Poland Blood. It seems to be a German film. Interesting.
So it gets more complicated.
Yes, someone should write her biography. That sounds fascinating. But anyhow, she is very good in this film, and I think that we will see in our next episode when we discuss Blackmail that she was a very crucial part of making those two films acclaimed. We don't have to agree on the Manxman. I liked it more, Sebastian liked it less, but both films in which Annie Ondra starred for Hitchcock, The Manxman and Blackmail, were very well received for a number of reasons, but I think a big part of their success is actually a very good female part played by Annie Ondra.
I totally agree, and I think that Hitchcock used some, we could say, typecasting when it comes to men, because both Malcolm Keane and Carl Brisson have already appeared in his movies. Malcolm Keane in The Lodger as a policeman boyfriend who was not that sympathetic in that movie, and Carl Brisson played the boxer in The Ring. Right, so in this movie we can see that Hitchcock kind of continued their characters, we could say, because Carl Brisson is this physical labor type of character, and Malcolm Keane is this we could say intellectual, right? He was not maybe intellectual in The Lodger, but he was using his head mostly to solve some mysteries. And so I just want to sum up that I think that Annie Ondra is really the strongest point. I agree with you, and except for the fact that she's hailed as the first Hitchcock blonde, I would also like to add that I agree with Charles Barr when he says that she's like a woman in a trance, and this quality of woman in a trance is very important in Blackmail, in one of the sequences in Blackmail. And here it also gives this movie eerie quality, and also she's the character that has significant. Could say we really sense a strong conscience in her, because she does want to tell Pete what's going on, and it's Philip who wants to maybe save his friend, not tell him the bad news, for example, about the child, that the child is not his really, but it's Philip's child, illegitimate child. So she wants to be open, to be honest, and Philip is this upper class lawyer who wants to keep the appearances in the society.
I fully agree, and also by way of summing up, I would say that this film, which apparently the same book was filmed in the United States in 1916, it would be interesting to compare those two versions. I think that the film version was actually lost. It was directed by George Lone Tucker, which, again, Charles Barr mentions in his book. But one final thing I would say is that this film is, for me, interesting also by comparison with German cinema of that time, which, as we know, Hitchcock was influenced by, but it's almost disarmingly Anglo-Saxon in its approach to sex, passion, relationships. If you compare this film with German films of that time, which also showed class differences and were melodramas and were showing this sort of Kammerspiel, small stories about marriages being broken by passion, etc. There was always the feeling that sexuality is this very dark force that completely overtakes the people, and here I would say that there's very little of that. It's mostly about honor, the sense of honor being violated, the sense of of the characters unable to resolve their feelings. There's definitely none of that Germanic, very dark, very perverse streak in this film. It's almost as plain as the landscapes of the Isle of Man, or rather Cornwall in the film. It's, very basic, very, very simple in a way. It's just, one man who is very naive, the other man who has a very strong sense of honor, and the woman who is quite ambivalent. But it's never, romantically fatalistic, for example. It doesn't have a fatalistic ending. I would say that it also shows Hitchcock's common sense, British common sense. But also one very last thing, at least if we are to believe the biographers, is that Hitchcock was already irritated on the set of this film by the fact that it was not a sound film. This film actually premiered after The Jazz Singer, the first talking picture in the States, opened, and Hitchcock was making this film, and already he was impatient with the fact that he's making something that is obsolete by design. So he really was itching to make his sound film, which we will discuss, of course, in the next episode.
So it's a very good transition to our next episode, which will be blackmail. But let me just add two things. I'm trying to watch some additional movies as a point of reference as much as time allows. And of course, I saw years ago the movie which probably you know and like a lot, which is Edge of the World by Michael Powell. Which reminded me, the Manxman reminded me a lot about this movie, and maybe it's no coincidence since Michael Powell was there in the somewhere in the industry already, as we mentioned in the previous episode, saying that he was doing still photography for Champagne. And he was also doing still photography, publicity stills for blackmail. So he was there. He knew Hitchcock, and maybe this atmosphere of a secluded isle and people living their harsh, ordinary but probably satisfying lives. It's a common theme for both movies. And also what strikes me is that we discussed that you said that it's a very subtle film as far as Hitchcock's silent filmography goes. And I would agree, of course. And also it's maybe a wider cultural remark that filmmakers, I think, portrayed countryside differently than the city. Maybe it's not a very original thought, but when I think about the movie Underground by Anthony Asquith, beautifully restored by the BFI recently, it's a classical example of a very vivid, very dynamic movie about the city. The title itself tells us about the setting, and the last 25 minutes of this movie is really this mix of metropolis, because we see power plant, we see this gigantic set of the president's office, and we have this kind of a chase in the underground. And I compare the Manxman with this movie, and probably I think this is my theory, that because of the setting, that you have this out of the city setting, you have this more restrained camera work, you have more classical style. I wonder if that's the way filmmakers were thinking about these things. That, for example, Hitchcock thought that I'm shooting in this beautiful setting, so there is no opportunity or there is no need for flashy camera work. But, for example, Anthony Asquith, I'm in the city and now I will move my camera as much as possible. It's also, these remarks are inspired by Keating's book about camera work in classical Hollywood. But I think there is something to it, and I think this idea of how to depict a city is also a good transition to the next episode about blackmail.
I fully agree, and I have no answer for what you just said, but it's an interesting point. Maybe, this can be thought of as sort of Hitchcock pastoral, and we'll see Hitchcock connecting with modern city in the opening sequence of his next film, Blackmail. And for now, this concludes this episode of Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. We definitely encourage you to listen more episodes. We covered all of Hitchcock's films so far, so you can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. We also encourage you to like our Facebook fan page, Hitchcock, the Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please share the news on Twitter and in social media. It's important for us to reach new listeners and listeners who are as interested in Hitchcock as we are. So this concludes this episode of Foreign Correspondents
Deeper into Hitchcock.